Hello again, this is a chapter 12 video. This is an introduction to errors and exceptions. So let's just have a consideration as to what errors we've seen so far. We've seen some syntax errors. Hopefully now you'll be getting to the point where your syntax errors are removed and you'll be able to spot the syntax error in that particular line there. The other kind of error which we've come across is our logical errors. As we've discussed before, logical errors are difficult to find. If you want to if your application is not doing what it needs to do, then that's a logical error. The programming language can effectively be programmed to do anything you want it to, so if you program it to do something incorrectly, then it will do that thing incorrectly but very well. So you need to be aware of these logical errors. Other error situations, so this implementation error, which is our logical error, basically is not answering the business requirements. So you have to be very clear of what the requirements are for the business, or for what your application is needed for. If not answering that, then it's an implementation error. Another type of error could be inappropriate object request error. So something like when we try and get access to an array list or an array or a hash map or some kind of collection, and the key or index that we're looking for is not there, then that's going to be an error as well. Another type of error which we've come across is when we've talked about casting. So if we cast incorrectly, if you cast your mind back to your static types and dynamic types, if you cast incorrectly, you'll get some kind of error as well. So those sort of errors there are really all programmer type errors, and errors which you should be able to sort of fix by yourself. However, they're not always programmer dependent errors. So there's often lots of things in life which can produce an error. So there's some examples up on the screen there. Someone's on a browser, they put in an incorrect URL. That's an accepted problem. You know, there is going to be an error created by that. And the point is, what do you do with it? Other types of user error. You've got environmental type errors as well. So if there's an interruption in the network, that's an error. You have to deal with that somehow. If the physical connection goes down or something like that, then that's sort of exit is going to happen from time to time. So the system can't just crash and just give up completely. It has to be able to get over that error. File processing as well is something which is particularly error prone. So you'll always get things like missing files, permissions, not the right permissions, someone trying to access the file at the same time, modification type errors, all those sorts of things. Other error which is not really put up on the screen there is the error regarding databases. So as part of your assignment, you've got to put an application together which joins and connects to a database. What if that database is no longer there? What if the query you put in is an incorrect query? What if the table you've requested for doesn't have a specific line in that table? So there's lots and lots of error messages which you'll need to capture. The program can't just give up at that point. It needs to sort of carry on gracefully. So we've got an application for illustrating some of this error messages, and this application is the address book project. So I've got some exercises for you to do. I'll leave another video for the actual exploration of that particular address book, and I'll do that and post that up on YouTube as well. But have a look at the address book and have a look particularly at this one, the address book version 1G. So there's address book demo, which is just basically a class which kicks it all off. The actual address book itself, a contact details class, and then the address book GUI. These three here are the important ones really to consider. You can abstract yourself away from the address book GUI to a certain extent, but what you can use the address book GUI for maybe is when you're developing your project later. It could be a useful starting point for developing applications, because there's a good it's a reasonably useful little GUI which it creates there. So in terms of these errors, how can we maybe get around doing them? So we've got this defensive programming idea. So there's two sorts of ways of thinking here. If we get a client-server situation, so should a server assume that the clients are well behaved, or should it assume that all clients are potentially hostile? So there's two completely separate things there which need to be programmed for effectively. Such issues you've got to consider. How much checking by a server on particular method calls. So if you've got a method call, does the server do lots of checks on that method call? Does it assume that the user puts in the correct information? What happens then if an error does happen? How is that reported to the system? Is it reported? What sort of mechanism is used? How can you plan for failures? So again, how can you plan that someone's going to put in an incorrect URL or a file's going to be missing or something? And should a client deal with these failures? So there's lots and lots of things to consider. To get your hands dirty with this, I want you to just investigate the address book projects and make a couple of changes there. There's an error which is isolated there on 12.8 and 12.9, so have a look at that. The next part of the video is going to look at the solution to those questions, so it might be a good idea to go and try and do it first before you look at the rest of this video. Okay, so one real area which is going to present a vulnerability for a specific server object or application is arguments passed to it. Constructor arguments, method arguments, these sorts of arguments, they're going to be passed to the class. So what's going to happen? Does the class assume that the parameters are correct, or does it assume that it could be completely incorrect? One way of doing it, like I say, is to from a defensive programming perspective, is to check whether the argument is correct or not. So in answer to one of the questions there is looking at the particular key. So previously the remove details method in the address book application or address book project didn't have any error or any details to check if the parameter was actually in use. So the parameter which is provided to the remove details method is the string key. That's then associated with a particular phone number. What this method now does is it uses another method called key in use and actually tests to see if that key is actually in use before it tries to remove it. If it tries to remove the key and it's not in use, then obviously you're going to have a bit of a problem. So this way you're actually checking the argument to make sure that it works. That's all well and good, but what happens if the argument is incorrect? Then what happens? How do we report a problem which happens? So we could just use an if statement. Or we've used the if statements before, so if it's less than 0 or if it's greater than the index, then it's not a correct parameter for an array list. But if it's a human user, then fine, you might give them an error message, but could they solve the problem? And what about then if it was another class using that class? Then what happens then? Can you return a diagnostic value, or can you throw an exception? We're going to look into throwing exceptions in a minute. One way of returning some kind of error report is to provide a diagnostic value. So in our remove details method, we could do something like this. We could provide the return type of the remove details method rather than void as it was previously to Boolean. That way that we can return true if we can remove the details, or false if the details cannot be removed. That's a handy little bit of diagnostics, because it will then say whether it was able to remove that particular key or not. After we've written that method, which returns a Boolean value of true or false, we can then write into the client class to deal with that. So if it is positive at the top here, if the contact details were removed, then we can do something and continue as normal. However, if it wasn't, then we'll need to return an attempt to recovery if possible. Now this is all well and good, but it could be quite unwieldy if we're going to use error messaging and we're going to just use if and else's to check errors. And that means you're going to have to deal with error messaging not only in the class which the error might occur, but you're going to have to consider that and write it into different classes which use that particular class. So when you write these other classes which interact with the initial class which creates the error or has a potential error in it, then we can either test the return value, so test if it's true or false, whether it has in our case removed the details, attempt a recovery on error, or avoid program failure. The other thing you can do is then ignore the return value. Then it can't be prevented and it's likely to lead to program failure. So you can't specify that the client class listens to the Boolean return value of true or false, whether it's been added or not. The other thing you can do, which you can specify, are these things called exceptions. So there's a couple of new things which we've included into this initial presentation, and the next presentation we're going to look at how we can deal with all of these errors, how can we report on them, and how we can force people to understand the fact that they are working with objects which potentially could cause errors. And that's throwing and dealing with exceptions, and that is in the next video. I'll see you then.